just like in the human world, language and culture are inextricably linked in many ways, and one cannot exist in a vacuum without the other. I think it's also true that one language can exist in a vacuum without other languages, and so that led me to creating sort of a wider ecosystem of language and culture that kind of existed within a wider network and became sort of a constellation of features within a wider world.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Margaret Ransdell-Green, a linguist, and Eric Barker, a musician, discuss their collaboration, creating music and lyrics in original constructed languages.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelika Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Dr. Margaret Ransdell-Green and Eric Barker join us for today's podcast. Margaret is a linguist who has been creating constructed languages, or ConLangs, since the late 1990s. Eric, her husband, is a musician and composer.
The two have collaborated on writing music and lyrics in the languages and styles of these fictional peoples.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Margaret and Eric.
Hi, thank you.
Hey, thanks.
So we always like to start out by asking our guests a little bit about their backgrounds and their own paths with languages. What does that look like for the two of you? Margaret, maybe you can get us started?
Yeah, so I've been creating constructed languages since around 1998, 1999, when I was really young. And it was actually constructed languages that got me interested in linguistics before I ever knew what linguistics was as a kid. And so between a combination of constructed language creation and learning other languages, I slowly got interested in linguistics, and that was what I went on to major in college when I went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then when I was in Hawaii, I did a master's and PhD in linguistics too. So it really shaped the sort of trajectory of my career, and many of my interests were kind of inspired indirectly by that.
Yeah, that's great. Eric, what about you?
Well, my background is primarily in music. Although I was raised by anthropologists. My dad has a degree in anthropology, and basically my aunt who raised me, who helped raise me, was the dean of the university here, but an anthropology professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And so I was born and raised in Bethel, Alaska, out on the Bering Sea coast, in a primarily Yupik Inuit community. So I picked up a lot of languages very early on.
Yeah.
And so and I took some sociolinguistic linguistic classes in school. I went to Oberlin Music Conservatory for composition, but I also dabbled in a lot of other classes along the way, including linguistics. So by the time I met Margaret, I was fairly new to it, but I had a little bit of an understanding.
Yeah, I think he's absorbed a lot through osmosis over the last 15 years.
Nice.
I'm always pleasantly surprised when he says something that's completely spot on. In terms of linguistics, he'll say something, and I'm like, "Oh my god, that's right, good."
I'm such a nerd. I love any science or field that I come in contact with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So I've really gotten interested in a lot of linguistic aspects over the years that
Nice.
I didn't know about before.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Margaret, you said that constructed languages were sort of your gateway to linguistics and your study of languages. Can you expand a little bit on how you discovered ConLangs, how you got into them, and how does one go about constructing a language?
Well, that's a good question. I think people in the conlang community are all drawn to it in different ways at different times in their life, and it's something that can be quite varied in terms of how people get started. But for me, it was something I started doing as a kid without knowing what I was doing, like without knowing that it was something that other people did. It was just part of how I played and kind of just spent time by myself. I started writing stories, and the people in those stories spoke other languages. And so first it was very simple. It was kind of like special items of vocabulary that I would use as a kid when playing. And then it kind of just all coalesced into a language that when I was young, I called Rhymish because it was originally invented to create rhymes and other kinds of like little poems. And so that language eventually turned into the first full conlang that I constructed, which was called Gotevian later. And the question about how to go about creating a language is both a technical and I think a creative one. And I think people do it in different ways. There are different kinds of constructed languages. So people will try to do what they call artlangs, which is basically languages invented for artistic or aesthetic purposes. But some of them are sort of philosophical languages in that they try to incorporate as many of some type of concept as possible. So they try to be extremely minimalist or try to have some kind of underlying philosophical concept to them. But that's not the only kind of conlang. There's a whole lot of other types as well. I think that most of the languages I make are probably be considered naturalistic, so that they try to mimic natural human language as much as possible while still being different and sort of fantastical in a way. They're still linguistically feasible. Also, you might hear the term fictional languages, which usually applies to languages that are seen in like works of larger fiction, like in wider sort of world building contexts. But really, there's a lot of ways of creating constructed languages. And in fact, I would say that most people who do constructed languages are not linguists, although quite a few of them are, I think. So there's really a lot of different ways to start with it. But I would say that like a basic knowledge of linguistics obviously helps. You don't have to know anything too super advanced. It's not required. And you certainly don't have to have any formal training in linguistics in order to start to do it. Yeah.
So you've also created some cultures, right, around the languages that you've developed. And I was wondering, like, does the culture come before the language, or is it the other way around? It's like the chicken and egg. What comes first, or does it just evolve?
They really evolve in tandem, I would say.
Okay, yeah.
Because just like in the human world, language and culture are inextricably linked in many ways, and one cannot exist in a vacuum without the other. And I think it's also true that one language can exist in a vacuum without other languages. And so that led me to creating sort of a wider ecosystem of language and culture that kind of existed within a wider network and became sort of a constellation of features within a wider world. Because I think that was something, that's one of the things about linguistics and how language exists as a social function as well as a cognitive one that was so compelling to me, is that it really does exist in this wide ecosystem and this network, this entire system of things that have to be defined by their context in part. And so that was one of the things that was most like interesting for me to do. So that's just sort of how everything ended up going, is that I had to do more and more. I couldn't just have like one monoculture, one monolithic language, because that's not really how it works in the world. So one thing just led to another.
Yeah. How many conlangs have you developed so far?
So it's kind of a difficult question because I've developed a lot for my own personal use, like for my own, personal world building purposes. But then also I've developed a lot for clients that I've worked with in the past. So like usually creators of some sort, like people who are authors or novelists or even like comic book artists or people who are looking to have something added to whatever medium they're working with.
Yeah.
To sort of add a level of depth to like immersion of whatever it is they're creating. And so I've created about 6 or 7 full languages for myself, for my own uses, but then I've done about 9 or 10, depending on how you count them for other people. Some of these are less developed than others. Some of them are more developed.
Sure.
Some of them are kind of like very simple. Some of them are really in depth. So, but yeah, I guess the answer is like about 16 to 17 total.
Wow.
I should mention for listeners, like further information, if they have more information on broader constructed language societies, there is a guild out. There's a professional guild out there called the Language Creation Society (LCS). Margaret is now the vice president of
Wow.
that finds professional conlangers for authors and for film producers and such. So they have a website out there. You might be able to give that later.
Yeah, that website is just conlang, CONLANG.org. And so it's pretty
Great.
simple.
And
That's
we'll include
yeah.
a link to that in our show notes.
I figured that might
not
be
just
of
a
interest.
guild, but just like a society or association
Yeah,
for people
yeah.
who are
I
interested.
don't-
Yeah, but it does function that way, sort of, as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Do the two of you have your own personal conlang?
We don't have any that he has worked on, like,
Extensively.
extensively, but he was definitely been involved in some of the
Right.
creation of words that I've done in the past. Like,
Yeah.
I used to, in order to come up with the vocabulary, I would run them by him and see what his sort of intuitions were about the
Yeah.
way that words sounded and what the meanings he could attach to them were.
Yeah.
Actually, we had some fun back and forth.
Yeah.
Maybe like 10 years ago or so. For a long time, I used to live out in the woods in a 16 by 16 foot dry cabin, no running water.
Wow.
Just it was a hole in the wall, but it sounded great. It was basically I lived in my studio. And
It was nice because nobody cared how much noise you made because nobody
Ah.
could hear it.
I had loud heavy metal bands practice there.
You
and
could do
nobody-
anything at
Yeah.
any time. No one would ever know.
But and when we first started seeing each other, we would play little games going back and forth, and she would bounce like phrases off of me, and then I would come up with words in Reelin or Gotevian or I forget some of the others that you were working on at that time. Or I would throw a phrase at her, and we would also think about like particles and how a word might be, and I'm blanking on the technical side of it, but created from a concept of a few different concepts
Yeah.
that would be a unique.
Yeah, we would think about like what morphemes would go into a word and how compounds could be created to come up with a larger concept.
Exactly.
Nice.
Well, so I think that might be a great seg to Eric to talk a little bit more about you and your contributions here, because I know you keep busy as a keyboard player and
Yeah.
multi-instrumentalist and composer. But what got you started collaborating on music with Margaret? And maybe you can tell us about the challenges and opportunities in writing and arranging in the style of a community that doesn't really exist.
Right.
What's
Well,
that look like?
Absolutely, Sam. Some background. Margaret is a musician as well. In fact, we met doing community musical theater. She's a trained opera singer, and so I had firsthand experience with her voice and musical skills. And when we first started getting to know each other, I started writing some music for her to sing, and she wrote some lyrics, and we started collaborating on English songs, and we even created an album worth of material, which we're still trying to release. We're actually just now put a larger band together to
Nice.
to refine a lot of this stuff. So then we I don't even know when it began, but she had written a song in Reelin, and I just sat down at the piano and started accompanying it. And then we played around with various things later. Over the years, we got busy. We moved to Hawaii. She did her master's and then doctorate degrees, and I was working and playing in bands and stuff like that. And then 2019 hit. We had a kind of a crazy summer of travel where she was doing her studies in Papua New Guinea on a Papuan language there. And she had already been to the villages a couple years previously. And for the next time, she was going alone, not with the team. So she wanted to have me along for support. And so we were in Port Moresby, PNG, and which is a fairly dangerous city in the world, but we were in a safe compound. And she was spending a lot of her time working one-on-one with a Papuan speaker from the village area that she was working on. And but we just had nothing to do. I mean, we couldn't really leave the compound and the house. And we had a conference coming up in Cambridge, England, later that summer, in which we had told people we were going to be performing a couple ConLangs songs that we hadn't written yet. So
My favorite way to motivate myself to finish a project is to
Get
back
yourself a
myself
gig.
into a corner. Yeah.
get yourself the gig, then learn the music, or then
Yeah.
create the music.
But it ended up working out really well because we were basically trapped for 2 weeks in our room. And then the government collapsed, but that was a
Well,
separate
yeah, that's a
problem.
separate issue. So
Oh,
there was a
right.
coup.
So there was a whole like vote of no confidence, but more violent, that happened. So we were definitely not going anywhere. We were just in our room with very little to do, really, except for like when I was working with my consultant, and then the rest of the time we were like, well, we got to do something. And it's amazing how having literally nothing else to do can inspire you to do more interesting things than you would have done.
Yeah.
I did a curious thing because we were traveling long distance, and I can't really bring these around. I own a couple Rolly Seaboards, and so which Sam, you may be familiar with. They're like,
I am, but for our listeners, please.
they are basically a very squishy, rubberized. If you can think about a fretless piano, and it's like a silicone surface with these wavy shaped keys, and you can kind of slide around from one note to another, sort of the way you would on a violin or a fretless bass. But they're fairly compact. This is a 49 key board, so it's kind of long, but they're extremely thin. They're like a board of lumber. They're actually quite heavy too, but they're easy carry on. You can just throw them in the baggage area, or whatever the space is. And so I had that in a mini one, a small 2-octave board that I just threw in my backpack. So it was easy to travel light with a laptop and sounds. And I was like, I'm going to get away from my meat and potatoes piano stuff, because we're going to be creating fictional instruments, fictional cultures. And I sat down and started like modeling various instruments. And we kind of wrote our set around using the seaboard so that we could travel to England easily. And also so it wouldn't sound exactly like, typical instruments. It was a nice fresh start, to be able to kind of create kind of new sounds. But we didn't want them to be too particularly electronic either, because these are in some cases pre-industrial societies for the most part.
Yeah, sure.
So, but we had 2 weeks of, she had an hour and a half to 2 hours of intensive stuff every morning, and then we were like, here we go. So, and it was kind of a whirlwind of inspiration. I have some 3D graphics modeling background, so I opened up Cinema 4D, which is a 3D modeling program, and started actually visualizing what these instruments would look like.
wow.
Came out with some models, and which helped inspire also their sounds. And then started developing some musical systems for these cultures as well.
Yeah,
That's
so we have
wild.
interesting, like, different scales that are particular to the cultures, and
Yeah.
different notation systems that he invented for these purposes. So that
That's
ended
so
up
cool.
really
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
That's amazing. So I think for anybody who's interested in developing their own conlang, what they need to do is trap themselves in a maybe 16 by 16
Yeah.
room for 2 weeks and just have at it, right? Let the creative juices flow.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's wild. Margaret, can you share some words or phrases of one of your conlangs?
In one of the major languages that I've worked on over the years since about 2005 or so is called Reelin. And this is a language that I have pretty much not completed, but I would say it's the closest to being a complete workable language. It's definitely usable for like all purposes. And it has about 3,500 words in it.
Wow.
So it's probably one of the larger lexicon, like vocabulary lists that I actually have. So a phrase could be like go matem ko anakuzap bi anait. I think that the sun has risen today, for example, or like be go matlimi basutet luminet zanrese bait besitap. We don't know how many people it eats every year.
Goodness, I mean, we certainly don't.
A fun thing I learned about linguists is from Margaret is when they get together, they create the silliest phrases. Like, and they just have a lot of funny in jokes all the time. It's just
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah, the one thing about linguistics and languages in general is that the example sentences sometimes in linguistics are really funny and random because we're just trying to illustrate like a principle and it doesn't really matter what the content words are.
Yeah.
And so sometimes they're really silly.
Yeah.
So I followed in that tradition.
I like that. I like that. Would you consider yourself fluent in all of the conlangs that you have been
No.
working on?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent in them all. I might say that I'm proficient or passable in Reelin.
Okay.
But I think most people who create conlangs, I've really only met one person who's totally fluent in their language. And yeah.
I will. One caveat is I would say that Margaret's definition of fluent is pretty hardcore. So
Well, she is a linguist.
I always err on the side of caution.
Yeah. Of course.
Understood.
Yeah.
So, do you have any future plans right now that you'd like to tell us about? What are you working on?
well, Margaret continues to do actively do professional work at ConLang. We're hoping at some point to land some large Hollywood gig at some point. Her mentor and advisor actually worked with Zack Snyder on Superman, Man of Steel,
Yeah.
as well as was it
Oh, she did a language for Power Rangers.
Power Rangers.
Reboot.
Oh, wow.
wow.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I feel the last what's the name for someone who creates conlangs? A conlanger?
Conlanger.
Yeah.
A conlanger. So the last two folks we spoke with about this were Cornell PhD students who worked on a language for one of the Marvel movies. So it's funny that's that's an interesting market, like these big superhero movies with alien races and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That makes sense, but
It's pretty
interesting.
good.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more common. It is not super common, but I think more people are electing to add things like that to their movies and in books and things.
It's pretty big right now, coming after the success of, earlier of the Lord of the Rings movies and the expansion on Elvish, but also Game of Thrones, of course, and now, Star Trek really kind of coming back in, and these are all fictional worlds that have extensive conlangs. Be it Elvish, Klingon, or Dothraki, So, and I think a lot of film writers and authors in general are realizing that that conlangs can really expand the world building for a setting, and that people are really attached to that. Even in just the normal languages, it occurred to me the other day. Of course, Everything Everywhere All at Once just won the Oscar for Best Picture. We just actually saw that for the first time last week, and I noticed just the fluidity of the code switching between Cantonese and Mandarin. I think there was some both in there in English, and it just and I don't know either of these languages, and it reverted to subtitles, but it really, really made the scenes come alive and feel so that much more natural. And I think a conlang in a fantasy setting will provides exactly the same thing. So I think
Yeah.
it's really, really taking form here. And
Yeah, I think people are learning that there is so much of identity and context and time and place and humanity really wrapped up in people speaking their own languages, and not just only having, a one world language for the entire setting of whatever you're creating. I think it adds a lot no matter what you're working with, and that's a really good example.
Yeah.
so I apologize. Back to the original question of what we're
Yeah.
doing. We kind of got off topic
Right.
there. ADD.
We love that.
All right. She's working on her on that stuff on the side, but we also put a larger band together. We're calling ourselves Lemma, and we've been gigging around town, and we actually have a statewide festival we're performing at in a couple weeks, and writing amongst other things, amongst pop music and rock songs and weird progressive rock escapades, as I do, some constructed language music that she and I sing for the group. So
Yeah, so we're taking that and rearranging those songs written in conlangs for a larger band context, which is really interesting because it can kind of shift genre sometimes,
Yeah.
because it's
Interesting.
from a genre that doesn't exist, so it can translate differently
Of course,
into
yeah.
real world human genres, and you can kind of bend that a little bit to whatever your purposes are. And so I think that's one of the fun things about writing conlang music in systems that are not from Earth, because you don't know what it might sort of come across as to an audience. It might be like more of a funk groove or blues jazz sort of translation, or it might be like a death metal. Like you don't know how it might come across.
Yeah.
one of the most fun examples, maybe I'll leave you with, is a song that we do that I love, called Phatakap. That it's one of the ones that we wrote in Papua New Guinea. But immediately we just started playing it at open mics and in various places, and we would do it at like a smoky bar in downtown Honolulu or something like that. With people have all had about 3 or 4 drinks on there, and it's a sing along, and we would teach them the phrase, and they would jump into it. And so the first time we ever played it, it was actually before the constructed language conference. It was like the night before we were going to leave on the plane. We had like an entire bar like jumping up and going, "Phatakap, become it," and like.
Yeah, they all did really well. I was thinking like nobody's gonna want to sing this phrase
Yeah.
in a non-existent language, and they were totally down. I was amazed.
The
like it.
audience participation
Yeah.
has been awesome on that, and it's really fun to see what every audience how they respond. But
I
I
bet,
can't wait
yeah.
for Juneau to get like the entirety of the Juneau Folk Fest.
Nice.
Meaning a lot.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. So we already heard a number of different websites that our listeners can consult, but are there other places where our listeners can find out more about the two of you and your various projects?
So at the moment, we're kind of going through the social media of Lemma to kind of create it again, or recreate it. But soon we should have some stuff on SoundCloud. If you want to look up Lemma.
But we do have a website for her languages, which has all of the music on there.
Yeah, so if you go to ionith.com, which is AENIITH.com,
Yeah, put it in the Zoom chat.
you can see the music section that's on there, and you can actually see a version of a poster that we did at the Language Creation Conference in 2019 in Cambridge. That's basically translated there on the website. So you can see these 3D models that Eric did of the different instruments and the sort of concepts behind the different musical systems and stuff like that.
Notation.
Yeah, the notation systems and things like that.
Fantastic. We will put all of that in the show notes. But
Okay.
before we sign off, we'd like to ask each of you to share a word in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn, maybe created, that makes you giggle. What do you have for us?
Okay, so I think I'm gonna say the word tsundoku in Japanese, which is the act of buying a lot of books and then never reading them all and letting them pile up.
Yeah, it's a familiar.
One
Yes.
of the most relatable things for me.
Absolutely. I like
Yeah.
that.
Growing up in going to kindergarten and going to Yupik language class, the one word that stuck around, and it's not particularly funny, but it just stuck with me over the years, is minklun, which is needle.
I thought you would choose aklung.
Oh gosh, I should have chosen
Aklung is what you say to like babies when they accidentally trip and fall, like oopsie.
It's like
Okay.
In Yupik, it's like a toddler oops.
thanks, dear, for saving me. That's a much better.
Minklun is
Fantastic.
Yeah, a klung. I heard I got a klung a lot when I was a kid.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Margaret and Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for having us.
Next week, we hear from Richard Kiley about transformative learning theory, international community engaged learning, and what dissonance has to do with it. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
Or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.